Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. This week's podcast will be a bit different than my usual topics. As many of you know, there's more to cultivation than just what happens in our gardens. Whether we like it or not, taxes and proper accounting are crucial to keeping our businesses afloat. I sat down with two CPAs, Betsy Morem and Mark Waller, who have founded an accounting firm specializing in working with folks in the cannabis industry. My upcoming podcasts include another visit with Suzanne Wainwright Evans, also known as the Bug Lady, to talk about what she has learned and encountered since last being on the podcast. And I also had a wonderful conversation with Dr. Abby Wick, who is an assistant professor at North Dakota State University and is an extension soil health specialist. Her knowledge of infield soil health practices and cover crops was really incredible, and I'll be putting that podcast out here soon too. Now on to the show. Hi, Mark. Hi, Betsy. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Now, I heard about you guys because I heard Mark talking on Clubhouse about a particular form that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But accounting is something that is not that, something that we normally talk about when we're talking about cultivation. But I wanted to cover this because I think it's something that we all have to be aware of. It's just the reality of growing in a legal market. And so I wanted to have you guys on to talk a little bit about what you do and how, accounting fits in and the finances fit in for the cannabis industry. Can you guys give me a little bit of your background and talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start. So my name is Mark Waller. I am a CPA. I co-founded Morem and Waller CPAs with Betsy Morem, who's with us here today, obviously. And our biggest thing that we do is really provide world-class accounting services for cannabis businesses for month-end, annual compliance, all the way down to your audits that you have to think about. And we really try to use kind of a data-driven, tech-forward approach. So one of the things that's unique about cannabis with regard to other businesses is that cannabis businesses don't have as many tools in the toolbox that most businesses do. They're very stringent on what they're even allowed to do at all with banking. There are many regulations for banks that say you can't work with cannabis due to it being a federally illegal substance on Schedule 1 of the federal government's schedule of drugs. And because of that, there are some banks that do work with cannabis businesses for sure, but there are not very many. And even the ones that do work with cannabis businesses are fairly well regulated. So it's almost like searching for something that you aren't quite sure to find. That normally any business can go down to the corner and find a bank, and most banks are happy to pick up new businesses. It's much trickier for cannabis businesses. So we really try to be kind of a partner with cannabis businesses, knowing what we know about partnering with other banks, making sure that they have banking services, and then providing end-to-end accounting services so that all of the different things that become very complex, especially for cannabis growers, we try to cut down that red tape as much as possible.
Great.
Betsy,
Yeah, Betsy, can you give me a little bit of your quick background here, and then we'll dive in with I've got some questions for you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Betsy Morem, and I'm a CPA as well, co-founder of Morem and Waller CPAs. I became interested in the cannabis space a couple years ago, but didn't really get into the accounting side of things until last year. But I have been providing accounting services for small businesses since about 2014. So I think that experience of working with startups and small businesses from the ground up has really helped me with cannabis clients, because a lot of these clients are starting from ground zero. So I'm really excited to be joining forces with Mark and to be providing world-class services to cannabis clients across the U.S.
Great. Well, I guess, for me, I guess my first question would be, what are some of the things as someone who is setting up a facility or a legal grow in a state, what are some of the things that you guys are seeing as potential pitfalls or roadblocks that people should be aware of?
So I think right away, it's the challenge of just finding a bank is it hits you right in the face when you first start. We work with some startup farms, and some of them are lucky enough to come to us with a banking relationship in existence, and some of our other clients are coming to us and saying, we have a license, we're ready to start, we bought some land, but we don't have a banking relationship yet. And cannabis or not having a banking relationship really puts you at a disadvantage right away for accounting, because once if you don't have a banking relationship and you're tracking things either through your individual accounts, sometimes maybe you have cash that you're working with, but it makes just the day-to-day record keeping much hairier than it really needs to be, which is unfortunate because so many of our clients that we work with want to do the right thing. They want to be upfront with their record keeping. They want to keep things really organized. So it really puts them at a disadvantage. I've been tracking federal banking bills, and I think there's one in the federal government right now that has some promise of happening, but there's no guarantee that it's going to happen this year. So for the time being, growers that are starting a new farm just get faced with that reality right away. That's not even getting into some of the other things that cannabis growers have to think about, like Section 280E, handling cash, handling internal control for cash, IRS audits, banks requesting information, etc. Just getting off the ground is hard enough.
So Mark, along those lines, if you were, say, a grower coming into the legal market and you may have been on the medical side and working strictly in cash, you may or may not have been paying taxes. You may or may not have claimed all of this cash. Do you have to be able to show where all the cash came from before, when you go to set up a banking relationship? And then if so, how does that work from an IRS perspective, I guess, when establishing a business primarily from, a business that's been run by cash for years?
Absolutely. So one thing that kind of goes unnoticed is that there is an IRS form called Form 8300 that any business that is handling large transactions of cash over $10,000 is required to fill out a Form 8300 every time they have those transactions. So just the administrative burden, that alone is huge. And so short of having a strong, a banking relationship in place, growers really have to think about compliance right away. And it's not, many small businesses and are set up, the IRS, I should say, is geared toward helping small businesses get started. But for cannabis businesses, the IRS does what they can, but they are faced with something that's really just kind of a beast right from the get-go.
So I do want to talk a little bit more about Form 8300, but I guess my question is, if let's just say I had a few $100,000 in cash and I wanted to start a legal cannabis business, from an accounting perspective, how does that happen? Or is that more of a legal question in terms of, I assume you need to get the money into a bank and set up a banking relationship to where you can start accounting for things so that you have an audit trail that the IRS can follow.
If there isn't a banking relationship there yet, it doesn't mean that we can't do our accounting. It just means that how we do our accounting is going to be a little more complex. We do have within our firm, we have kind of all the work papers that we need to kind of handle any type of situation. So certainly there are businesses that have started that don't have a banking relationship. They may have an attorney that they've hired and are tracking a few different things from how they're creating their entity. A lot of new cultivators who are looking for investors, for example, might be looking to uh, be founded as a C corp, which in many respects is more beneficial to new businesses that are looking for investor dollars. So there may be already some of these professional relationships set up. Um, then what our job is as their accountants is to track any of those contributions to the new entity, any expenditures out of the new entity. What we try to do is kind of tailor our accounting software in a way so that you can kind of track any owner contributions or any owner distributions, legal invoices, any of those types of things that come into play, especially from a startup pre-revenue standpoint. But it is really important to capture all of those things accurately, because regardless of what you have going on, once you start that entity, the clock is ticking on filing your annual reports with the IRS. And certainly with the way IRS is going right now, there's a federal movement to beef up the budget of the IRS to increase tax compliance and collection on tax revenue. I would be very surprised if there wasn't also an increased compliance effort made by the IRS, especially toward cannabis businesses that, because of Section 280E, potentially can earn more tax revenue. And that's a thing. I think this is just me opinionating here, but I do think when we're talking big picture about Section 280E, certainly as legalization becomes a bigger topic federally, 280E is a big piece that obviously a lot of people want to go away. But the elephant in the room is, if that goes away, where does the revenue come from? So there's certainly a delicate dance being done, I think, in the federal government with respect to that it would be great to legalize tomorrow, but there's a lot of things that need to be sorted out before that happens.
Okay. Do you have any recommendations for a new facility in terms of potential banks to look into that you've worked with, or also accounting software that you really like? I mean, we use QuickBooks Online right now, but I've used a variety of different accounting software on my end. What do you find most popular for both of those options?
I can answer that question, Mark.
Yeah, go for it.
So I think in general, those that are looking for banking, I would look to your local credit unions. With our clients, we've found that they're able to establish banking relationships with more credit unions. And I, in general, think that credit unions are great to work with. Secondly, in terms of the accounting software, Mark and I, we use mainly two different systems: QuickBooks Online, TAD, which you said is what you use, and then Xero. And I know some people have run into issues with QuickBooks. Some cannabis clients have run into issues with QuickBooks. So we are sort of guiding most of our new clients in the direction of Xero. But in general, what's great about both systems is that they're both web-based. So that gives cultivators better access to their books, being that they can just log onto the web at any point and take a look around. So
if I may add to that a little bit as well, like Betsy, like you were saying, the web-based tools are really nice. And one thing that makes working with businesses, not just cannabis, but all businesses right now, really interesting from an accounting standpoint is because all of these tools are online, and so many of them are built to work together and interact with each other. And having an online platform for your base accounting system like QuickBooks or Xero gives you a big advantage going forward, because as more tools, especially in the cannabis industry, get developed, all of those tools are being developed in a way that makes it so that it interacts with your accounting software. So I would advise. I'm personally not for or against any of the different accounting systems. I think they all have pluses and minuses, but I would definitely advise, if you're thinking about going online versus going desktop, I would definitely advise going online.
Yeah, the cloud-based systems are great. I've actually done a lot of research on this for my company because we were using QuickBooks Desktop. One thing I'll say is switching financial software is really challenging from a comparative perspective year over year. So once you pick one, it's really great to stick with it. Xero is great. You know, it's actually spelled Xero for people who want to look that
Yes.
one up. But for me, it didn't work because here in Washington State, if I ship something to Eastern Washington, I have to pay sales tax based off of that location, not off of my location. And some of these, for some reason, Xero just didn't offer that functionality at the time. And so we ended up going with QuickBooks Online just strictly for that reason. But, you know,
Sure.
looking at what other software integrates in is really important too, because, you know, I've had to have, you know, apps and other software allow me to connect my Shopify site with, you know, QuickBooks Desktop and all this stuff. So yeah, that's less of an issue for a cultivator, I think, as it is for someone in the retail side like me. But yeah, definitely look into that. The pros and cons are great. And then in terms of credit unions, yeah, I've had the same issue that you guys mentioned. My bank basically, you know, they told me not to answer that I work in the cannabis industry because technically I'm not growing cannabis. So they felt okay about that. But if you say yes, you do, which you have to legally if you are growing, it really limits your ability to do a lot of banking stuff or work with a lot of banks. Like I've been denied loans just because they, you know, Googled my name, I think, and decided that I was, you know, I fell into that category. So
Right.
it's unfortunate.
Yeah, as far as specific banks to work with, if a new client comes to us and doesn't have a banking relationship established, and they're in another state that perhaps we're less familiar with, we have contacts within our network who can offer up suggestions of credit unions within that state that work with cannabis clients.
Great. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I do want to talk a little bit more about Section 280E. I am looking at the definition for people who aren't familiar with it. It's a section of the IRS code that forbids businesses from deducting otherwise ordinary business expenses from gross income associated with the trafficking of Schedule 1 or 2 substances, which is where cannabis falls. Can you kind of explain that in more common language as to exactly what that means for a cultivator?
Yeah, absolutely. So Section 280E, your definition that you read is spot on. The thing that makes it tricky for cannabis growers is really twofold. One is the record keeping that's required to kind of have your ducks in a row with respect to ensuring that you would be able to make it through an audit of the IRS are very tricky. And the reason for that is just like you said, is there are a number of different expenses that for a quote unquote regular business would be able to be deducted. Basically kind of anything outside of the realm of the actual production of your product, rent expense, you know, utilities, meals and entertainment, travel, things like that are a normal course of business type of expenses are generally not allowable to be deducted for cannabis growers. So until the federal law changes to move cannabis off of Schedule 1, that is going to be the law of the land. And what that really means is you're paying more in taxes. And obviously nobody wants to pay more in taxes, but that being said, you run a big risk by trying to push the envelope too much with regard to what types of deductions you take on your tax return. There have been a number of, oh, go ahead.
Oh, so just to clarify, if you're working with a CPA that's not aware of this and say does take these as business expenses, you talked about meals, entertainment, some of these other things like utilities. If you get audited, you will have to pay these taxes plus potentially penalties or back taxes
Absolutely.
on this.
Sure.
So in the long run, it could end up costing you quite a bit if you don't claim this up front. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And especially, like I was saying earlier, there's definitely going to be an increased presence on cannabis as more and more states become federally legal. And there is just the kind of this unfortunately not many CPAs will touch cannabis because of all the reasons that we've talked about. And so there's a shortage of good CPAs that will help growers navigate through these kind of tricky situations.
So, along these lines, the one that I see a lot on my end as being someone who provides soil and nutrients and those sorts of things is some growers that we work with will give us a resale certificate or some sort of agricultural exemption, either in the name of the business or in a shell corporation of the business that owns that business. Is this okay? Because it's about 50-50 here in the state in terms of people who pay the sales tax that are growers and those that hand me a certificate. And essentially by giving me this resale certificate, it's passing the buck. So if I get audited, what's going to happen is they're going to say, hey, why didn't you collect, sales tax from this grower, this company? And I'll say, well, they gave me this resale certificate, and it kind of passes the buck, and they'll follow up potentially with that company and say, hey, why did, are you charging the sales tax on your end? Does that work with cannabis is my question. Because I know, with farmers and other non-cannabis companies, this isn't really an issue, but I don't know with cannabis.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would be really cautious about not doing as much as you can to stay in compliance as a cannabis business. Just because as cannabis becomes legal, there's still all of these different issues that cannabis businesses are going to be facing. There's, if it turns federally legal, there's still likely going to be local opposition. Certainly you'll see, even in states where cannabis is legal, there are often groups of local municipalities, sometimes it depends on what the state law is written like, but occasionally there can be municipalities that say the state law says that cannabis is legal, but we don't want cannabis in this town. And so there's I would always advise any of our clients to be overly compliant more than try to push the envelope, just because there's going to be a huge target on their backs.
So I do realize my question is a state tax question versus a national or federal tax, which is what the 280E refers to. Here in Washington, for example, if I'm making, a product and I use these inputs to go into my product, I don't have to pay sales tax on those inputs because I'm going to be charging sales tax to the final user. So I'm not being taxed twice for the same product. But sure. I maybe that's a state specific question. I don't know if that's something you've come across. I was just curious.
Yeah, I think it's gonna vary state by state, obviously, but I do think that's going to be something every state's going to deal with, maybe slightly differently, but ultimately what's going to be most important is that you are doing what you are supposed to do to pay what tax that you need to. Obviously not trying to overpay tax by any means, but doing everything that you can, all the way down to something like an exemption certificate, sales tax exemption forms that you may have to fill out for your state. Just doing all of that as above book as you can.
Have you worked with any cannabis companies that have been audited yet and seen anything there that were things to watch for, I guess?
We haven't worked specifically with them, but we've definitely, as part of the national network of CPAs that we're involved in, we have seen other accountants in our network that have had that happen, and there's been a number of different court cases, some that have gone all the way to the Supreme Court, that a lot of us are tracking really closely. Most recently, the case regarding Harborside, which is a cannabis business in California, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they still ruled in favor of maintaining Section 280E. So there is there is still quite a bit of work to be done. I would say, the IRS hasn't gotten to a point yet where um, a point where, like, I've seen in other industries, in my prior experience in public accounting, for example, in the mid 2000s, the IRS audited many credit unions, and that was a result of finding parts of their business to be not not really part of their exempt mission, which resulted in a lot of credit union businesses um, paying more tax than they needed to, or that more tax than they had expected to. And that really was a result of what the IRS, I think, is doing right now, which is kind of gearing up their budgeting. And certainly, cannabis could be a target for increased audits like that in the future. We don't know for sure. We don't know for certain that that's going to happen. Obviously, the IRS is not going to come out and say, "Hey, we're going to audit you," but it certainly would make a lot of sense that would be coming. That being,
Especially with the complexity of the accounting. Um, it feels like the cannabis industry would be sort of an easy target for additional revenue for the IRS.
and I would say too, I've actually been on conference calls with the IRS who section that would be dealing with this, and uh, a lot of people have kind of a bad feeling about the IRS, that they're the big bad guys. But when you actually work with the people that are in charge of these, they want you to stay compliant. In fact, they really like working with CPAs like our firm, because they're not necessarily the subject matter experts either, and they want to make sure the way that they approach things is doing it right, and they look to see what's going on in the industry as much as we look to see what they're doing. So I, and maybe this is just me having worked with the IRS for many years on many different areas. I don't see them as the big bad scary wolf in the corner necessarily, but you do want to make sure that you're doing what's right, and following what they have to say. They have actually, over the past year, they have released more information about marijuana related businesses. Actually, if you Google IRS marijuana, they put out a really nice webpage probably 6 months ago that starts to talk about some of these things. So I would just say they're not scary necessarily if you're doing things right, but you want to do things right.
Yeah, I've had a kind of a roller coaster relationship with the IRS myself. We got audited, before we were ever even doing business in the cannabis industry, and the lady who came out and did our audit was really nice, but man, it's a ton of hours. It's a lot of work, and even if you're trying to do things by the book, it's really easy to screw up. Unrelated to that audit, I got a letter in the mail. Oh, it was probably like 10 years ago now, from the IRS saying I owed $15,000 in back taxes. And basically, what happened was I had, when I was setting up my business PayPal account, I had put in my Social Security number instead of the business UBI number, because it had a spot for a Social Security number. And then when the laws changed around the accounting for companies like PayPal, right around that time, they came after me for claiming I hadn't paid taxes. Now, I'd paid taxes on it through the business because it was business income. That money did not go directly to me. It went to the business, which was owned by my parents at the time. So we had accounted for it there. But getting this corrected with the IRS, I probably had 60 hours on the phone with them at least, just on hold and then talking to them. And, they're like, hey, you need to go into the local IRS office. So then I have to go in, make an appointment. And the lady there, like, she legitimately laughed at me and she's like, you're wasting my time. I absolutely cannot help you with this. You need to go back and talk to him on the phone. And it was a nightmare. The whole time, I've got this $15,000 bill that's accruing, more and more penalties. And finally, I ended up paying my CPA at the time over $2,000 to essentially just write a stupid letter saying that we'd accounted for it another way. But, it took me about 2 months of trying to get this figured out. And it was a nightmare. And even then, having to pay that money to my CPA, who I think overcharged me quite a bit, it's not fun. And it's really easy. It was a simple mistake I made. I saw a spot for a social security number. I put it in and I shouldn't have. I should have used my federal tax ID. So it's just the little stuff like that that can get you. And it's really frustrating.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can believe that.
It can be really scary. And that's kind of the value that we bring to clients is making sure that they're audit ready at any given point. And ultimately that helps them sleep at night. So that's kind of priceless to the business owner.
It absolutely is. And I want to say that's sort of how I heard about you was because I was listening on Clubhouse and heard Mark talking about Form 8300, which was one of the reasons the main reason I wanted to get you guys on the podcast, because I had never heard of Form 8300. And so why don't we start there and then I'll share a little bit of my backstory on it. But could one of you describe what that form is and how it relates to, our industry?
Yeah, so basically any cash payment that is over $10,000 must anybody who receives that type of payment should file a Form 8300 with the IRS. So obviously for cannabis businesses that don't have a bank relationship or do a lot of work in cash, that requires quite a bit of extra paperwork that has to be kind of earmarked by Form 8300. And there are penalties for not filing those 8300. So when we talk about potential audits that could be targeted toward cannabis businesses, certainly that's going to be one of the IRS's tools in their toolbox of saying, do you have cash? Yes or no. Obviously, a lot of the businesses will say yes. And did you file all your Form 8300s? Most likely, there's going to be a lot of businesses that have not done that. And so that's just going to be, low-hanging fruit for audits.
Yeah. So when I heard Mark talking about this, it kind of surprised me because I had heard something around this $10,000 mark, and I've taken a few transactions like that. And I thought the bank was filing them on my behalf. And so if I ever deposited more than $10,000, they would fill out a form and send it off. And I thought that was the end of it. And since I'm doing everything legal, I figured that was enough. What I learned was the bank doesn't send anything. They have an internal process over, and I can't remember the number at my bank. It might have been 5,000 or 8,000, where they make a notation on my account, but they're not sending anything off to the IRS. It's my responsibility to fill out this form. And the other thing I learned was that all transactions that are considered related and exceed that 10,000 as a whole must be reported. So it doesn't matter how many transactions a deal is broken into or how long within, a 12-month period. If you space it out, if the IRS considers them related, you can be penalized for failing to file. So there's some nuances with it that go along with it too. And as someone who tries to follow the rules and, as someone who tries to be compliant, this was something that I had, dropped the ball on strictly out of ignorance.
Right, exactly. And I think that's going to be the case for a lot of businesses, because it's also not a very widely circulated piece of information. The IRS, I talk about their website. Their website is actually very good, and it does have very good resources about this. But it is fairly clear when you read into the Form 8300 reference guide on the IRS website what is required and what what you could be facing if you don't do it. So you scroll all the way to the penalty section, and it goes right into civil penalties for negligent failure to file can be up to starting with $100, not to exceed 1.5 million per calendar year. So
Range.
they absolutely do not mess around with this. Obviously, the purpose of Form 8300 is a good one. I mean, the real purpose is to provide an audit trail for to avoid anti-money laundering, and basically to enforce anti-money laundering efforts. So having a paper trail with the IRS, certainly it covers you. If you are dealing with a lot of cash transactions and they are all for legal cannabis, certainly you want to have yourself covered as well as a business owner. But yeah, go.
I would want to be aware too, if someone else, if I'm paying with a cash transaction, that they're going to be listing this down, because you actually put the identity of whom the cash was received from. You can select if you think it's a suspicious transaction, if you don't get all the information that you need from them. But it's a fairly extensive report, and you have 15 days from the time of receiving the money to get this filed. So it's good to know, now that we know about it, we're absolutely doing this. And so I have to talk to growers and say, hey, if you want to pay me cash, be aware that this is a form that I have to fill out legally.
Yeah.
And so they're aware that their name's going down in this information. Now, the other thing too to be aware of is, whether they deposit that cash directly into the bank account, or they, send a cashier's check or a money order. All of those things are considered cash. So the only, just be aware of that you don't get around it by, doing money orders in $1,000 increments. You're still expected to fill out this form, or someone's expected to fill out this form if you pay in that manner.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, that was the biggest thing I wanted to cover in this podcast, because it was totally new to me. So thank you for allowing us to get that out. Is there anything else in terms of, potential things to watch for, or even things, warning signs maybe your CPA isn't up to speed on your industry? What are the things that, I'm thinking as a grower, what can I look for to sort of improve my accounting process?
I can start with that one. I think, we talk a lot about cannabis specific things such as Section 280E, increased compliance efforts that are required for banks for cannabis. But I always come back to the accounting 101. Are your accounts reconciled? And it doesn't matter if you're a cannabis business or you're a flower shop in town or you're a restaurant. If your accounts are not reconciled, if your inventory is not reconciled, if your cash is not reconciled, those are also low-hanging fruit for the IRS and for auditors. Honestly, there are a number of different places, both in the IRS website, banks, etc., that expect that as a business owner you have reconciled accounts, and that's challenging enough, let alone having all of these extra complications as a cannabis owner. But when we start working with new clients, we reserve about 90 days just to clean up your books, especially if you're a business that's coming from one accountant to another. There's always things that we need to clean up to make sure that you're running like clockwork on a month-end basis, because that's your minimum requirement as a business owner, is to have clean books that anybody can look at and review and feel confidence in.
Betsy, did you have anything you wanted to add in that regard?
I think Mark said that perfectly. If anything, I would just say, if you're a business that I think some people, like I'll use the analogy, if you haven't filed your tax return for 5 years, um, some people might feel embarrassed to approach a tax accountant with that information, but we are here to help business owners. And so I would just encourage, if someone is feeling intimidated by everything that has to be done from the accounting perspective, or if they're feeling behind, just to um, not feel embarrassed about what they are, where they are, because we can always, do our best to fix things retroactively. So the important thing is just to kind of get things right going forward.
Absolutely. And just to end on a positive note, I do have a very good friend who was on the medical side, wasn't paying taxes, and, for over a decade, and was able to get into a legal cannabis facility, get squared up with the IRS by working directly with the IRS and his CPA. And, in a few years' time, was able to show enough income to get a mortgage, purchase a house, and be totally legal and above board. And for him, in this case, just the amount of stress and everything in getting that all resolved was huge, knowing that he was above board with the IRS and it was able to fix some of this stuff. So you absolutely can get it done. And, there is some work to do there, but it's absolutely possible.
Yeah, well said. Well said.
All right. Well, I super appreciate you guys taking the time during, I know your busy season, to come on the podcast and talk a little bit about accounting. If there's anything else you'd like to add before we end the podcast, feel free. Otherwise, I just want to thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much for having us, Tad.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
All right. Have a wonderful day. That was Betsy Morem and Mark Waller, and you are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. Don't forget to check out the podcast page at www.kisorganics.com. Just click on the Learn tab, then Podcast. And if you haven't already, please take a moment and leave us a comment or review on whatever platform you listen on. I do take the time to read them all and appreciate the feedback. You can also follow us on Instagram at KIS Organics to stay up to date on the latest podcast releases and information. Thanks for listening.